Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Great Decisions 2022. I'm Tim Kaczynski, Manitowoc Public Library. I'm here with an exceptional presenter this evening, Professor Beth Doughtery from Beloit College, and we'll be getting into tonight's subject, Biden's agenda, in just a second. Before that happens, I would like to, as always, thank our series sponsors, because without them, Great Decisions wouldn't be happening. So a huge thank you going out to the League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, and Lakeshore Pax Christi. So a huge thank you to our sponsors. If anyone would like to get a pamphlet for the Great Decision series, which has all of the lectures laid out and all the speakers, show up at the library. They're available at the front service desk, absolutely free. It also gives you an idea of how, if you were interested in donating to Great Decisions, how you could do that. Also, if you are interested in picking up the companion publication that goes with it, Great Decisions 2022, that is also available at the main service desk for $15 cash or check. So it's a great way to get yourself primed and ready for these lectures that are coming up. So one other thing before I get to Professor Doughtery, we have an incredible panel discussion coming up this Thursday evening that I thought this particular crowd would be interested in. It is called Power at the Polls. It is all about the current voting regulations, about day of registration, mail-in balloting, absentee balloting, everything you need to know for every upcoming election. So go to the polls with confidence, and remember that knowledge is power. So Power at the Polls is a great way to get started. So now that I got that plug in, let me introduce our speaker for this evening. And let me actually make her the primary focus. Beth K. Doughtery is Major Professor of International Relations and Professor of Political Science at Beloit College. She received her MA and PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. Since joining the Beloit faculty in 1996, she has taught a broad range of international politics courses, including U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, the politics of mass killing, human rights and nationalism, and ethnic conflict. She has received both campus and national awards for innovative teaching. Her main research interests are transitional justice, focusing on the cases of Iraq, Sierra Leone, and Bosnia, human rights, and Iraqi politics. So, without further ado, I would like to have Professor Doughtery take it over. I'm actually going to take myself out of the picture, and the screen is yours, Professor Doughtery.
Great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Tim. And I'd also like to extend my thanks to the Manitowoc Public Library for keeping the Great Decision series going in very difficult circumstances over the last several years. I am really looking forward to the opportunity to return in person. Hopefully that can happen next year. So tonight I'm going to talk about the Biden administration's challenges in confronting a rising China and a rising Russia. The current international system is oftentimes described as being a liberal international order. And in the Great Decisions book, John Eikenberry, who wrote the companion piece for tonight's lecture, is one of the leading academic theoreticians around the liberal international order. He's written some phenomenal books, so I really recommend anyone who's interested in this particular phenomenon should really take a look at some of Eikenberry's publications. But the liberal international order was established after World War II, right? And then it was consolidated further at the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. At that point, when the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States emerged as a unilateral hegemon, right? And for a number of years, it actually had almost unchallenged power at the international level. That has been difficult for both Russia and China to abide by. And so in the last several years, we have begun to see more of a challenge to American leadership at the liberal international order. I want to just explain very briefly what I mean when I say the liberal international order. So it has three main components. The first one is the security order that was established in the aftermath of the Second World War. Here we're talking about a rules-based order that indicates what states may and may not do with respect to the use of force. So for example, the fundamental rule of the post-World War II security order is the non-use of force except in self-defense. The Security Council is meant to be the final arbiter of whether or not force can be used at the international level. Respect for territorial integrity, right? That you do not occupy and annex territory that belongs to another state is another example of that. And the security order has actually been relatively successful in the sense that there have been very few interstate wars, so wars between two countries, since 1945, and in particular, since the end of the Cold War, there have only been about 5 conflicts of that kind. Right? And there have been no great power conflicts, so no war between the US and the Soviet Union or between the US and China. So the security order is the first part of the liberal international order. The second part of the liberal international order is the economic order. This, again, is rules-based and institution-based. So the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and what originally was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, which is now the World Trade Organization. And that economic order has pushed for free trade and open markets and has been kind of a cornerstone of the prosperity that many states have witnessed since the end of the Second World War. The last piece of the liberal international order evolved a little bit more slowly, but has really consolidated itself since the end of the Cold War, and that is the human rights order. It has become more important and more deeply entrenched over the last 30 years or so, and it includes ideas such as humanitarian intervention, right? The importance of multi-party democracy and representative government, protecting the civil and political rights of individual citizens. In the post-World War II liberal international order, as the representative of sort of that liberal notion of what the international system should look like, the United States was in charge of producing a lot of what you might think of as public goods. And these included things like international security, a free trade system, freedom of navigation, financial stability. From the perspective of Russia and China, and from some states in the developing world, of course, the US's role in the liberal international order isn't necessarily so benign. They see it as a way for the US to maintain its hegemony. Russia and China in particular, though, and Tim, if you want to pull up that first slide, Russia and China in particular chafe inside of this system. They think that it has set up to continue to perpetuate American power and prestige. They deeply resent and fear many aspects of the liberal international order as a threat to their legitimacy and even to their ability to stay in power. So the US is currently facing really aggressive challenges to its leadership from Russia and China. Now, there's many ways we can think about measuring power, and I'm just going to quickly run through a number of slides to just give you a little bit of quantitative information about this. So usually when we talk about power at the international level, we mean material power, military power, and economic power. The United States across the board is at the top of all of these lists. China is a strong second. Russia is strong on the military side, but weak on the economic side. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So one way to think about this is the size of their nuclear arsenals. The US and Russia dwarf every other state in terms of the number of nuclear warheads that they have available to them. It's also the reason why anyone contemplating a possible war between the United States and the Russian has to be deeply, deeply concerned, right? China only has about 350 warheads, but it is in the process of modernization, and it is planning to have at least 1,000 warheads by 2030. Next slide. In terms of the military expenditures, the United States and China spend the largest amount of money on their militaries. Russia is also within the top 4. And even if you look at that as a percent of GDP, the United States, China are still at the kind of in that top echelon of states. Okay, next slide, please. And so as a result of that, this allows China, the United States, and Russia to have some of the largest militaries in the world. One thing I would note here about this is that the United States is the only one of those 3 powers that has what you would call a blue water navy. In other words, capable of being everywhere on the open seas. The Chinese are growing ever stronger in the Pacific, and they are also investing in submarines, and in particular in nuclear submarines and other naval assets, because they would like to challenge the United States in terms of having a blue water navy, especially in the South China Sea and in the Pacific. Next slide. One thing that the United States has going for it that China and Russia simply cannot compare with is its ability to protect its military presence all over the world. So the United States has about 750 military bases in dozens of countries around the world. The Russians and the Chinese have only a handful of such bases. This makes it easier for the United States to project its military power far away from its borders. Russia and China are more of a threat to their immediate neighborhood. Next slide. When it comes to the economy, again, this is the United States and China are clearly dominant in this aspect, but the Russians are not really even a player here. The Russian economy took a terrible hit in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it is struggling to recover. Next slide. The one economic area where Russia is a major player is in the energy sector. It supplies a large amount of natural gas to a large number of European states, Germany in particular. And this gives it the ability to influence the policies of other states because they are reliant on the Russians for their energy requirements. Over the last number of years, the liberal international order has been in turmoil. We've seen this both domestically in Western states because of what's called democratic backsliding, but this extends even more broadly. For the last 15 years, there has been a steady decline in the number of democracies in the world and a rise in the number of repressive regimes. There's uncertainty over U.S. leadership related to the Trump administration and the way he treated U.S. allies, et cetera. And then these very assertive, aggressive policies that the Russians and the Chinese are putting forward. So this is a return right now to an era of what you would think of as strategic competition. And Russia and China in particular represent what are called modern authoritarian regimes. They are trying to put forward an alternative to the liberal international order that has been dominant at the international level since the end of World War II. These are just some of the important characteristics of modern authoritarian regimes. In particular, I would note the sovereignty piece, where both Russia and China believe that any kind of criticism of their human rights record is undue interference in their domestic affairs, and push back very strongly against any kinds of criticisms of that way. A redefinition of democracy. Both Russia and China are at a point now where they feel that seeing the kind of disarray and weakness in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in the aftermath of Brexit, they feel like they can assert the legitimacy of their systems, right? And say, look, Western democracy is in chaos. It isn't anything special. Our systems are stable, right? They're more willing to defend the kinds of values their authoritarian repressive systems are built around. If you want to go to the next slide, please. One way you can easily see how this is playing out is in the repression that both regimes undertake, what China has done to the Uyghurs, China's crackdown on Hong Kong, its threats towards Taiwan, increasingly aggressive actions in the South China Sea. China is also engaging in a practice now that's called wolf warrior diplomacy. And this is a very assertive, strident rhetoric and actions actually by Chinese diplomats that has emerged since Xi Jinping has come to power. And the Chinese are asserting, again, their system is successful, that the CCP does not have to apologize for the kind of rule it has domestically. And so when it feels disrespected, its diplomats are really going to push back. So for example, this spring at the Anchorage summit that the United States held with Chinese officials in March, the US made statements about Chinese human rights abuses, and the Chinese immediately pushed back, accused the United States government of slaughtering Black Americans, explicitly said, the United States needs to stop telling other countries what to do. Even people in the United States no longer respect democracy. Okay? Next slide. Another aspect of this repression on the part of China and Russia, and a number of other countries do this, Saudi Arabia and Rwanda, is what's called transnational repression. So these states no longer are just content with domestic repression, right? Keeping their citizens quiet, keeping the opposition under wraps at home. Now they are projecting their power overseas and engaging things like assassinations of regime opponents, abductions, and bringing these individuals back to their home countries to stand trial, arresting the families of dissidents who are abroad and then throwing family members in prison in an effort to try to force these individuals to come back. A lot of digital surveillance. Many Uyghur families who are in the West have said that after years of not being able to get in touch with members of their family, their phones would ring. It would be the number they thought was their family, and instead it would be a member of the Chinese security forces on the line warning them to stop criticizing China. And so these are just a few small examples of the way in which China and Russia are really pushing against American leadership and the human rights and security values in particular of the liberal international order. Next slide. So what the Biden administration has been doing since it came into power is recommitting the United States to one of the key norms in the liberal international order, which is multilateralism. So the United States rejoined the World Health Organization, has donated a significant sum of money to help the World Health Organization deal with the pandemic. It has donated more vaccine doses than any other country in the world. It rejoined the UN Human Rights Council, which the Trump administration had pulled the United States out of. The US was actually elected in 2022 to a 2-year term. Biden's administration has been a leader in terms of global climate change, again, in stark contrast to the previous administration. And they've been making a forceful defense of democracy. One of the best examples of this is the Summit for Democracy that was held in December. While media attention to the Summit for Democracy was oftentimes pretty negative or just saw this as some sort of propaganda the US was engaging in, a lot of activists and scholars had a much more positive view of what happened here, because people think the US does need, and the West does need to defend democracy because it is under threat from Russia and from China. So in addition to this kind of multilateral, the US is just reasserting its leadership. It's trying to revitalize its alliances, to rebuild relationships that were damaged under the previous administration and create new ones. Next slide, please. Two really good examples of this are the Quad, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. When the Biden administration originally came into office, it had already determined that it wanted to take a harder line against China. But before the US even spoke to Chinese officials, Biden's administration was holding consultations with the Quad, explaining the new U.S. policy, getting feedback, trying to ensure that that they are on board. The Quad has never named China directly in its statements, even though it's very clear that that's the whole purpose of this organization, is to try to constrain Chinese power. They've stepped up their defense partnerships with one another. They have held joint naval exercises, again, a signal to China that it needs to tread carefully on the South China Sea, and has put a lot of focus on health diplomacy, climate change, and other kinds of issues like that. A second example of the United States' efforts to increase this kind of global leadership and repair its partnerships is this new security alliance called AUKUS, which is the United States, Australia, and the United Kingdom. This is largely built around the sale of nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. Many of you may remember that when this this new alliance and submarine deal was announced, the French government was irate. They actually withdrew their ambassador from Washington for a brief period of time. The French had a deal with the Australians, but there are all kinds of complications around why Australia, I mean, there were cost overruns, things were taking longer than they wanted. Australia really felt like it was being pressured by China, which was very angry because Australia was calling for an international investigation into the handling of the COVID virus. And so Australia and the United Kingdom actually approached the United States and said, okay, we should put together this new strategic arrangement. And so the United States is now going to sell nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. That will make Australia only the 7th country in the world to have that kind of a capacity. So as part of all of this, the Biden administration has made a calculation, or at least most of the Biden administration. So there are still some people within it who are kind of pushing back against this, but people like Jake Sullivan and Avril Haines, for example, are very much on board with this new conception, which is, for a long time, the assumption was China could be peacefully integrated into the liberal international order. The more integrated it was into the economic system, the more its political system at home might evolve away from an authoritarian and kind of repressive regime. That is no longer the case, right? China has become actually increasingly aggressive in its suppression of political dissent. It is going after a much broader array of opponents than it once did in the past. So now, human rights lawyers, women's rights advocates, ethnic minorities like the Uyghurs, journalists, etc. It is just engaging in very widespread repression. It has very tight control over the information sphere in China, so that Chinese citizens are only getting what the Chinese government wants them to hear. There is a elaborate surveillance regime here. Many of you may have heard the stories that US and other athletes were told to take burner phones with them when they went to the Beijing Olympics, because the Chinese were insisting that this software be downloaded onto their phones, which has like a censorship base of about 2,500 different words that would trigger the Chinese censors to get involved, right? They prevent access to information or news on a really wide and actually perpetually evolving set of topics. And sometimes, using Chinese social media like WeChat, for example, a lot of times people's privileges will be suspended. They will only have the vaguest notion of what they did or said that caused that to happen. And so then you end up with a lot of self-censorship as well. So the Biden administration no longer believes that China is peacefully going to evolve. Instead, it's going to treat China as a strategic competitor. What that means in practice is that we're going to de-link issues. So instead of saying, well, okay, China, if you'll give us a concession over here on climate change, maybe we'll temper our criticism of your human rights record on this side. The administration has specifically said that it's not going to trade concessions across policy in that way. It's willing to cooperate with China in areas where there are mutual interests, but the Chinese cannot expect anymore that the United States will back off of what it sees as its core interests in an effort to try to further incorporate China into the international system. Biden has made a number of, has been consulting with its allies in the Quad and with AUKUS. There was a virtual Quad summit that was held in Washington, D.C. In September. Usually after the U.S. has had high-level consultations with its allies, then it will have high-level consultations with the Chinese. So there have been a lot of kind of like direct Biden-Xi conversations, or top U.S., top Chinese diplomats speaking to one another over the last year. Again, China is pushing back against the Biden administration's against its policies. And of course, the latest kind of flashpoint in that relationship was the administration saying it would not allow it was not going to send American diplomats to the Beijing Olympics because China is committing genocide and crimes against humanity against its Uyghur population. And that's where you then begin to see the Chinese with this much more kind of aggressive style of diplomacy answering the United States back. At the Anchorage meeting that was held just about a year ago, the Chinese gave a 2-page list of demands to the American diplomats. And basically what it amounted to, China wanted the United States to stop criticizing it on anything it considered to be a core interest. In other words, no more talk about human rights, no more talk about Hong Kong, no more talk about Taiwan, no more talk about the Uyghurs, no more talk about the South China Sea, etc., which of course is unacceptable to the administration. All right, in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to talking about Russia, because while the United States and the Chinese, this is certainly going to be a long-term kind of like battle for global hegemony, the most immediate threat right now, as I'm sure you're all aware, is coming from Russia and the possibility that the Russians will invade Ukraine within days. Tim, if you want to go to the next slide, please. Actually, you want to go again? We can just skip that one. Yep, and skip that one too. Sorry. Yep, that one too. Yes. Okay, on to Russia. Vladimir Putin harbors a really deep sense of grievance about the way in which the Cold War ended and around the collapse of the Soviet Union. He greatly resents the loss of the Soviet Union / Russia's superpower status. He believes that it is not even that Russia, that Russia is not actually being treated or respected as a great power, and he is determined to try to return it to that place. He also fears the spread of representative government, right? Because if representative government spreads to areas in the quote unquote near abroad, places like Georgia or Ukraine, right, that might give Russians ideas. And so, Putin very much wants to ensure that democracy and representative government in general is made to look as dysfunctional and chaotic as possible, right, as a way to try to keep himself in power. Finally, Putin sees competition between the United States and Russia as a zero-sum competition, right? So any gain for the United States automatically means that the Russians have lost on that particular score. Right now, what Putin is focused on is trying to create a new European security architecture to replace the post-Cold War architecture that we have seen. He wants to reverse the steady flow of Western power closer and closer to Soviet or to Russian borders, rather. Tim, you can go to the next slide. In particular here, Putin is aiming to reverse, actually, NATO's expansion since 1997. Right? So on these maps, what you can see is in the top map on the blue and the red is the former Warsaw Pact, right? And at the bottom is current NATO membership, right? So many of the countries, in fact, nearly all of the countries that were in the Warsaw Pact have now joined NATO. And Putin is especially concerned about the possibility that Ukraine will join NATO. Putin's demands that he has articulated to Western diplomats as this crisis has evolved over the last number of weeks have included wanting the United States and NATO to withdraw their forces from the members that were previously in the Warsaw Pact. So that includes countries like Poland and the Baltics. He wants the United States basically to give a never ever pledge as far as Ukraine's membership in the as NATO is concerned, so that never ever will Ukraine be allowed to join NATO. And coupled with all of this, right, is this rejection that Putin has of kind of Western, what he would call Western values around human rights and representative democracy. The current crisis in Ukraine is just the latest effort by Putin to try to weaken and undermine the West. If you want to go to the next slide, Tim. One of the things that the Russians have been doing for a number of years is fomenting struggles within countries in its near abroad. And here in particular, again, we're looking at Georgia and at Ukraine. Approximately 20% of Georgia's territory is currently occupied by Russian allied forces. You have a separatist area in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region, again, that is being propped up by the Russian government. And of course, Russia annexed Crimea, which was part of Ukraine, in 2014. Putin knows the military balance in Europe favors NATO and the United States. So he is not trying to compete directly militarily with the United States. What he's trying to do is use other forms of power to try to undermine the Western position. So one thing is striking at his neighbors if he sees them as moving too close to the West and then seizing part of their territory, as happened to both Georgia and is potentially happening to even more of Ukraine. Maybe if we'll go to the next slide, just one of the reasons why Ukraine is especially vulnerable to the Russians is because it does have in the eastern portion a large population of Russian speakers. Vladimir Putin, since the annexation of Crimea and the separatist control of eastern Ukraine, has actually handed out about 700,000 Russian passports to people who are Ukrainian citizens. This could give the Russians the pretext of saying they have to invade Ukraine in order to prevent the Ukrainians, right, from harming Russian citizens. The next slide, please. So these are just maps showing the current position that we're in, where the Russians have about 130,000 troops surrounding Ukraine on three sides. They're engaging in military exercises in Belarus. Currently, those exercises are scheduled to end on February 20th. The concern here actually is that Belarus is so close to Kiev. It's only about 50 miles, I think, between the border between Belarus and Ukraine and Kiev, which is the capital. So, I mean, a swift and easy way to decapitate the Ukrainian government is to simply go in and seize Kiev, which is further away from Russia proper. One of the things that the Russians have really emphasized, and you can clearly see this at work in what is happening with Ukraine, are disinformation campaigns. Right? The European Commission has called Russian disinformation campaigns the greatest threat to the European Union because they said these campaigns are systematic, well-resourced, and perpetuated on a larger scale than similar campaigns by other states. The Russians use disinformation campaigns to question the democratic legitimacy of the United States, the European Union, and various states within the European Union and the UK now. They attempt to polarize these societies by inflaming sensitive topics within them. And they are just generally trying to erode trust in institutions and elites as a way to weaken the ability of the United States and the West to try to counter them. Right? So there's four main goals of these Russian disinformation campaigns. The first one is to roll back U.S. influence as a way for Russia to regain its great power status. The Russians think, with very good reason, right, that these disinformation campaigns will cause major domestic problems for the United States. And then that will force the United States to have to focus its energy and its resources internally. And that leaves it less likely to be able to project its power externally. It also thinks that if it can drive wedges within the body politic in the United States, then that makes it more difficult for the administration to pursue a foreign policy to try to check what the Russians are doing in places like Ukraine. And certainly the clearest example we have of this effort to roll back U.S. influence was Russian interference in the 2016 and 2020 U.S. elections. These disinformation campaigns are also meant to try to preserve what Russia considers to be its sphere of influence. And right now, Ukraine is the focus of that. And on a related point, to keep Vladimir Putin in power in Russia. Again, the idea is make democracy, and especially US democracy, look chaotic and unappealing. Make it look as if it can't get anything done. That makes it less appealing to Russians and to others. If the US looks dysfunctional, then it undercuts the ability of the United States to push forward the liberal international order, and in particular to try to hold up human rights norms, etc. And if the West looks dysfunctional, if the US looks dysfunctional, right, that increases the legitimacy of the Russian system by comparison because it looks so stable. And then the fourth main goal of these Russian disinformation campaigns is to enhance their military effectiveness. Divide allies. So in other words, divide NATO allies in particular, right? And then within NATO allies, divide the body politic, right? Obscure facts on the ground to make it harder for the West and the United States to counter what it is the Russians are doing. So after Russia invaded and then annexed Crimea, the Russians consistently denied that they had forces on the ground there, right? Some of you may remember the conversations from the summer of 2014 talking about, quote unquote, the little green men that were running around in Crimea, because Russian soldiers went in green uniforms, but without any insignia. Later, Russian officials would confirm that, in fact, those were Russian forces that had gone into Crimea. Another example of these efforts to try to obscure facts on the ground, the shoot down of the Malaysian airliner Flight 17 over eastern Ukraine. The Russians blamed that on other parties, even though eventually international investigation showed that it was a Russian-made missile that was launched from a Russian military base that brought that plane down. The Russians also believe that this kind of disinformation gives them greater freedom of action in places like Ukraine. One other piece of this that I will just mention is that the Russians are using state control of media, both at home and abroad. So it has created the media companies Russia Today and Sputnik. These two Russian outlets operate in 100 countries. They have programming in over 30 languages, and they have budgets on par with that of the BBC and France 24, which is the French equivalent of the BBC. So you have slick production values on stories that don't have anything to do with Russia and Russia's interests. Then you can present the facts. When it does have to do with Russia and Russian interests, then you try to mix in fact and fiction, right? Again, in this effort to obscure what's going on, make the Russians look good, undermine the confidence of the West in what it is trying to do. And Russia has been really successful in some ways in shaping international coverage of the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. So a lot of media attention frames the story as Russia perceives that it is being threatened by the eastward expansion of NATO. Okay, so that puts the onus of responsibility. This is NATO's fault. If it wasn't expanding eastward, the Russians wouldn't be doing any of this. What they are not talking about is the fact that, first of all, the Russians invaded and annexed Ukrainian territory in 2014. Right? This is one of the most blatant examples of violation of the fundamental rules of the international system that we can find. When Iraq attempted to do something like this in 1990 against Kuwait, the combined weight of the international community met that in Operation Desert Storm and kicked the Iraqis out. It is, if the Russians continue to be allowed to get away with annexing the territory of their neighbors, then the entire post-war collective security system is going to disintegrate. Russia also has a very particular disinformation narrative that it is spreading around Ukraine. And it goes as follows. Ukraine is a Western puppet. The Ukrainian government is a hotbed of fascist Nazis. Cooperation between Ukraine and the West, either the European Union or NATO, poses a direct security threat to the Russians. Ukraine and NATO are the aggressors, and Russia is the victim. Some people joke that if all you saw was Russian-sponsored media, you would believe that Russia was a small, defenseless country surrounded on three sides by an aggressive Ukraine, which is, of course, the exact opposite of the facts on the ground. Russia insists that Ukraine rightfully belongs in the Russian sphere, and Putin has actually gone even further in saying that the Ukrainians can only enjoy true sovereignty if they are part of Russia. The Russians are also claiming that the Ukrainians and NATO are planning a false flag operation as a pretext to attack Russia. And in particular, they were beginning to spread rumors that the Ukrainians or Americans were going to use chemical weapons in Ukraine and blame it on the Russians, again, as a pretext for starting a war against Russia. A lot of this narrative is the exact reverse of what is actually happening. Russian outlets like Sputnik and Russia Today have also, for example, been trying to create domestic turmoil in the United States and elsewhere by criticizing the West for spending resources on Ukraine during the COVID pandemic and questioning why Ukraine is important to any of these particular states. The real concern here is that Vladimir Putin appears to be obsessed, if not, as one person put it, delusional when it comes to talking about Ukraine. He has asserted that Russia and Ukraine are one people, which, again, flies in the face of all the available evidence. The Russians had a referendum, or a referendum that they put together in Crimea, in which the Crimeans were supposed to show that they wanted to join Russia. The Russians said that 97% of the voters had turned out, and that there was an overwhelming majority in favor of being annexed by Russia. Several months later, though, Russian state documents were leaked that showed that the turnout was probably more like 30%, and that the percentage of people who voted in favor of annexation was probably closer to 50%. Crimea is the most pro-Russian part of Ukraine, and even there, they couldn't get half the population to support the move that they were taking. So I put all of this out there about these Russian disinformation campaigns, partially because I think it's important that people remain alert to the fact that the Russians are doing this, but also because this really helps explain what the Biden administration has been doing over the last several weeks. This is what someone has called pre-bunking rumors, right? Rather than waiting for the Russians to do something and then trying to challenge it after the fact, the Americans are being very upfront about the intelligence they have that indicates what kind of narratives the Russians are planning on using. They're hoping that if they kind of name and shame Russia, if they pre-bunk these kinds of narratives, that it will cause the Russians to think twice about what they're doing, because their cover story basically has been blown. Many people in the Biden administration feel really burned by what happened in Crimea in 2014, where they had a lot more information than they were willing to share publicly out of fears for uncovering methods and sources of intelligence. And then the Russians went ahead and undertook this blatant violation of international law. So this time, the administration is going to get out in front of these kinds of stories and is really challenging Russia's ability to shape the narrative around what is happening in Ukraine. Secondly, as part of this sort of emphasis on multilateralism, the Biden administration is closely coordinating with our NATO allies on almost a daily basis. They have been very clear about what the position of the United States and NATO is with respect to Russia's demands vis-a-vis Ukraine. So they have responded seriously to the notion that Russia may have concerns about the post-Cold War security architecture in Europe. They have indicated places where they are willing to negotiate around things like conventional weapons levels, nuclear weapons proliferation, nuclear weapons in general, et cetera, and that they're willing to talk seriously with the Russians about those things. They have also made clear, however, that they are not going to offer a never ever pledge about Ukraine. First of all, NATO did several years ago say that Ukraine could join NATO. It never gave them any kind of accession agreement. Like, there's no plan for how Ukraine could go about joining NATO. And there really isn't any indication that NATO is interested in allowing Ukraine to join. Ukraine would have to meet a certain set of standards to get into NATO, and it's just simply, it's not there. So the Russians are really kind of manufacturing this idea that somehow there's this NATO expansion into the Ukraine. It's the principle that the Biden administration and NATO are defending, which is, as a sovereign state, Ukraine should get to determine who it allies with, right? And so they may not want Ukraine in NATO, and they may not let Ukraine into NATO, but they're not going to flat out say in advance, we will never, ever let Ukraine into NATO, because the Russians don't want to allow that to happen. Again, the Biden administration has made clear that there's no intention for the United States to directly intervene in Ukraine, but it has been organizing a multi-pronged approach to try to, again, make the Russians think very carefully about any possible move against Ukraine. In coordination with its NATO allies, a number of additional military forces have been deployed to states on the eastern flank. So in particular, they have deployed about 3,000 extra American soldiers into Germany, Romania, and into Poland. Other NATO states are also sending those kinds of forces into those frontline states. Some of the Baltic states are providing additional assistance to the Ukrainians. Poland, the UK, Canada, the Czech Republic, the Baltics are all offering additional security assistance to Ukraine to again, try to, as the administration says, make Ukraine a porcupine, right? So that if, in fact, the Russians attack, it's going to be very difficult for them to digest the porcupine. There has been a warning of very clear consequences that will arise for the Russians if they actually do move against Ukraine. The administration wants to be certain that the Russians understand the severity of the consequences that will happen. Again, they have been trying to coordinate closely with our European allies to ensure that everybody is on the same page here. Tim, I'm going to have you forward a couple of slides down. Yes, this is the one. Yeah, I'll show. Yes, this one. Yeah. So one of the biggest issues here in terms of how could you make Russia feel pain if it did anything to Ukraine has to do with oil and gas resources. So there is this major pipeline, Nord Stream 2, which runs directly from Russia to Germany, because Germany gets nearly 50% of its natural gas from the Russians, right? A lot of natural gas that comes out of Russia actually goes through pipelines that run through Ukraine. And so Ukraine has been earning about $2 billion a year in transit fees that the Russians have to pay. So the Russians see Nord Stream 2 as a way to undercut the Ukrainians, because if they can export all their gas to Germany via Nord Stream 1, which is already operational, and then Nord Stream 2, which is not yet online, they're going to deprive the Ukrainians of a significant source of revenue. Right? Nord Stream 2 actually about doubles the capacity of Russia to export natural gas directly from Russia to Germany. Nord Stream 2 has been very controversial from the beginning because the Americans and many of our NATO allies, but Poland in particular, and obviously Ukraine, see Nord Stream 2 as a geopolitical tool of the Russians, that they can undermine the energy security and ultimately national security of Germany, right? And it gives them additional leverage over Ukraine, because the Ukrainians will have lost this significant source of revenue. So the Biden administration, which actually lifted sanctions the Trump administration had placed on the Nord Stream 2 project at Germany's request, has now said the US will not allow this project to move forward if the Russians move against Ukraine. There is some concern about whether or not Germany itself is also willing to go that far. They have made public statements that seem to indicate that they would put an end to Nord Stream 2, but they haven't actually been explicit about that. But so the administration has put forward this really robust package of sanctions, trying to hit Putin and his oligarchs and military leaders in particular, freezing their assets abroad, freezing their bank system, putting sanctions on Russian banks that will make it very difficult for them to be able to interact with the international banking system. The U.S. has also been trying to supply additional natural gas to Europe. So the U.S. has actually been sending some of its own supplies to Europe. It's been trying to get some of our Gulf allies, like the United Arab Emirates, to agree to send additional supplies of natural gas into Europe. But it does seem clear that the administration is trying to signal to the Russians that if they move against Ukraine, the most important interest that the Russians have, which is this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, is definitely going to be on the chopping block. So the administration is hoping that this kind of coordinated show of multilateral cooperation, that there are no divisions within NATO, right? Showing that they understand what the Russians are doing by trying to counter their disinformation campaign, right? And then being willing to call out and then punish Russian bad behavior by being very clear about what the consequences will be if they go against Ukraine is kind of part of this larger package of trying to prevent basically a ground war in Europe. And there are fears that the Russians may, in fact, I mean, one possibility is they use this as a way of increasing their control over eastern Ukraine, portions where there are lots of Russian speakers there. Maybe they're going to try to replace the current Ukrainian government with a pro-Russian government. Or maybe they're going to do what they did to Crimea, which is to take the entire country. Again, Vladimir Putin believes that Ukraine belongs to Russia. Right? He does not see the Ukrainians as being a separate people. So the Biden administration is facing a very different challenge than administrations have had to face since the end of the Cold War, which is that this return to strategic competition, this belief that neither the Russians nor the Chinese are going to change, right? That their interactions with the liberal international order are not going to bring them closer to the liberal international order, but in fact, they are trying to replace it, that they are trying to undermine American leadership and put themselves in charge of the international system. And the biggest tool that the administration sees that it can use in both of these cases is multilateralism, shoring up our alliances, building new alliances, and ensuring that that cooperation reaches across a whole broad spectrum of things, cooperation on military issues, on health issues, on climate change, the whole host of issues that are confronting them. So I guess the one final comment that I would make, and then I'd be happy to hear questions and comments, is there is some discussion about if the Russians were going to move, when they would do it. February 20th has been flagged as a potential date because that's when they annexed Crimea. It's when the Beijing Olympics are over, and it is the final day of Russian exercises in Belarus. So probably for the next week, we're all going to sort of be on tenterhooks to see whether or not the Russians really do go ahead and invade Ukraine. So I thank you for your attention. And again, I'm open to any questions or comments that anybody might have.
I'm going to add myself back in a tiny picture. Did we get to see one of your cats wander through earlier?
Yes, unfortunately, they think I'm talking to them. So yes, I was.
It's glad that they feel like engaging as well. But we do have some questions that have come in and comments. I'll start with a comment and then go to a question. Somebody, Dina, wanted me to point out that your presentations are always so engaging and informative, and thank you for presenting them. John wanted to know, what is the value of Crimea to Russia, and does the fact that it was given to the Ukraine in 1953 as friendship gift for 300 years of being joined? And he also put in an additional comment, add as a factor into their reasoning for taking it back.
Yeah, so there is a naval base in Crimea. that is especially important for the Russians, and which they have really built up a great deal since that 2014 annexation that gives them, it's right on the Black Sea. And so that gives them more power projection capability in that area. Crimea's population is probably the highest percentage of like pro-Russian people in Ukraine, and in particular along the far western coast of Crimea. That's almost overwhelmingly, it's almost all native Russian speakers. And Vladimir Putin believes that the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the greatest geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. And he says that because of the fact that Russians got left behind in other places. So that's part of what he is trying to do. It's also a way to place additional leverage on Ukraine. There had been a pro-Russian government in Ukraine in general, which was replaced and overthrown, and a more a government that wanted to move in the direction of the European Union, and NATO was put into place. Putin finds that very threatening, and so again, this is Crimea is a tool to put more pressure on the Ukrainians, leverage that it can use to try to ensure that Ukraine does not continue kind of spinning off into the Western orbit. It's really more of a message to the Ukrainian government about the limits of what Russia is going to be willing to tolerate. They did that. So the pro-Russian government was overthrown in a popular revolution, and within a couple of months, the Russians had moved into Crimea. So there is a direct link, actually, between that sort of more representative government being established in Ukraine and the Russians attempting to put pressure on them. One other thing I would mention, so the Russians did sign a treaty in 1994, the Budapest Memorandum, in which they agreed to respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, which would include Crimea, in return for Ukraine giving up all of its nuclear weapons. Because Ukraine had a significant number of nuclear weapons that were placed there when it was part of the Soviet Union. So in 1994, the Russians signed away any potential claim they had to Crimea.
Dina had a very interesting comment and a question. Isolationism is dangerous, yet we face serious internal concerns that threaten the continuance of our own democracy. Are we capable of being so involved abroad and keeping our democracy/economy intact?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it applies not just to the United States, but to a lot of Western countries as well. That as you've seen this democratic backsliding, the rise of more illiberal parties in the United States and other places in Europe, it has produced a really deep division about how U.S. foreign policy should be conducted, right? And so, most of you probably remember a time when the saying about U.S. foreign policy was that politics ends at the water's edge, that Democrats and Republicans were united around a certain set of policy principles, like containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War. That is absolutely no longer the case, right? And so, during the testimony to Congress in the first impeachment hearings of Donald Trump, you had a lot of Russia experts in the US government who were testifying, like Fiona Hill, who were saying, look, the narrative that Republicans are offering about the US role abroad and its relationship with Russia, they're just parroting Russian propaganda. And that is a real concern. So in some ways, the US's ability to maintain its leadership abroad is intimately linked with its ability to maintain its democracy. And kind of like the more dysfunctional the US system gets domestically, the harder it's going to be for the United States to be able to protect its power overseas. And that, of course, is precisely what the Russians want to see.
I have a question. Since what you hear, basically the Putin point of view, that is broadcast. What are the feelings of the average Russian citizenry about what is going on now?
So you have to keep in mind that Russians are fed a steady diet of Russian propaganda, right? And so, like I said, that there is this joke in Russia that the belief that Russia is a defenseless country surrounded on three sides by an aggressive Ukraine. For many Russians, that's what they think the reality is, because they're not getting any other kind of information. The other thing is Russia has been increasingly nationalistic since 2012. So there was a period where there was some steady economic growth, but by 2012, when Putin came back into his position as the leader in Russia, the economy wasn't doing quite as well. And so he basically campaigned for that position on a platform of Russian nationalism and reasserting Russian power. And the annexation of Crimea was really popular in Russia. They saw this as bringing Russians home, and they're being fed this line that people in Ukraine want to be part of Russia. And so, there is significant popular support for Vladimir Putin in Russia. But part of that is precisely because of the regime's ability to basically shut down all dissent. And they completely control the media environment. So people are not hearing the other side. They're only familiar with their own narrative.
If anyone has any questions, please just type them into your comments bar on either Facebook or YouTube, and I will pass them along to Professor Doughtery. I did want to mention, and this isn't, it is a plug for an upcoming lecture, but you had mentioned the Quad Alliance, not next week, but the week after. That actually is the subject matter of the lecture on the 28th of February, is the Quad Alliance, given by Professor Marty Farrell, now retired, of Ripon College. So I love the way that the Foreign Policy Association sets up these lectures that one feeds into another shortly thereafter. So if anyone has any questions, please type them into your comments bar, and I will pass them along to Professor Doughtery. Fantastic lecture so far. I hope that we get a few more questions. Do your cats have any questions?
No, but they are preparing to invade my space right now. So, yeah.
Are you surrounded on 2 or 3 sides?
Just 2. I only have 2 cats, so there's only the 2 ways that they can come here. So, yeah.
You're keeping them at bay, it looks like.
Yes, I'm doing my best. Right? Yeah, I mean, I do just again want to underscore that we are in a really dangerous time. There really is the possibility that there's going to be war in Ukraine, and that is just going to have all kinds of repercussions moving forward. Even if it's not full-scale war, even if the Russians only incur a little bit into Ukraine, if we start putting sanctions on the Russian economy that are going to target the oil and natural gas sector, eventually we're going to feel that in the United States because the price of oil is already high. And if there's any kind of supply disruption, it's just going to send prices even higher.
I know it would just be your opinion, but how likely, what percentage would you place on the chance of this invasion of Ukraine actually happening? Just in your opinion.
I honestly don't have any real sense of how to do that. It's kind of hard to know
Sure.
what Putin's intentions are, but U.S. officials seem to be very certain that this isn't a question of when, it's a question of if. All right. Or not, I'm sorry, the other way around. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when.
Okay.
That they do think that Putin intends to invade and is waiting for the most opportune time. Right? There's been conversation that maybe Xi, President Xi in China has asked the Russians not to do anything till the Beijing Olympics are over, to try to not overshadow that. And that, I mean, that may have something to do with it. It may be that the Russians are just going to continue to put this off. They have another week of military exercises in Belarus, because the longer they have 130,000 forces around the borders, the more likely they may think it is that there will be some sort of crack in the Western alliance, or that the Ukrainians might even offer some kind of concession to them. But I would also note the Russians can't keep 130,000 troops at the state of mobilization that they're at. They cannot keep that up for an extended period of time. There would be very serious economic consequences to that. And so at a certain point, either the Russians are going to have to move, or they're going to have to start pulling some of their forces back. And Putin is going to have to figure out how he's going to explain that to the Russian people.
Just to change course just a little bit, going back to the earlier part of your lecture, John had another question of, is China concerned about expanding their influence beyond the Pacific area?
Yes. And so the Chinese are using infrastructure as a technique to spread their power, to project their power outside of Asia through what's called the Belt and Road Initiative. These are infrastructure projects, and they Chinese, most of them are in Asia, but the Chinese have also reached as far as Europe and the Middle East, sub-Saharan Africa, to try to bring countries closer to the Chinese orbit. There are plenty of countries in the developing world that are willing to partner with the Chinese, because the Chinese, unlike the Americans or the Europeans, don't lecture anybody about their human rights or democratic credentials. But there have begun to be some signs that there is some pushback from some of the states that are involved in the Belt and Road Initiative, that there are higher debt to China than some states thought that they would get. Some countries are unhappy with Chinese companies taking the bulk of the contracts that are involved in some of these projects. But yes, China is definitely trying to step up its influence beyond just the Pacific. It tried to engage in a little bit of vaccine diplomacy, but it was more coercive than anything. So, for example, telling Nicaragua that they would give them COVID vaccines, but only if Nicaragua withdrew its recognition of Taiwan, which then the Nicaraguan government actually did. The Chinese are looking for energy resources as well. And so actually that might be a useful way for the Russians to diversify, so they're not so heavily reliant on Western Europe, especially if it looks like the Europeans are going to start pulling away from them. And so that might be an area where you'll see China and Russia have a lot closer cooperation, is in that energy sector.
So Anne had a question, and it sort of ties into what you were just saying, but it also is more about global warming as well. How will geopolitics change with global warming in these areas, do you feel?
Well, This is one area where there is a little bit of tension within the Biden administration, and it has to do with policy around climate change. So the administration has come in and really reversed the policies of the previous administration. So, it made 2 cabinet level positions that were related to climate change. It has a climate change envoy. This has become an important part of American diplomacy and American leadership. And John Kerry, who is coordinating the administration's climate change policy, is one of the people that has been pushing back against delinking different issues, because he says, look, the United States needs the Chinese to cooperate on climate change because they're, one of the world's largest emitters of greenhouse gases. The Chinese have to be on board. And so people within the administration who are more on that side of the policy agenda are concerned that delinking might mean that we're going to lose Chinese cooperation on climate change kinds of issues. But that's about as much as I could say with respect to that question. That's something actually that my colleague Pablo would really be the person to ask, but he already gave his lecture last week.
All right. Well, and if you would like me to ask Pablo for you, I will email him and get back to me. So just email me at the library if you would like me to ask that question. But moving on, Laura Conklin, she just wanted to thank you for such an informative presentation.
Well, thank you. I appreciate everybody taking time to listen this evening.
Well, a couple more questions, if that's okay with you. Nancy wanted to know, what is the probability that Germany will accept non-use of the Nord Stream gas pipeline?
Well, I think that the Germans are under pretty heavy pressure from other countries in NATO, Poland in particular, who are already upset that the Germans have allowed this project to move forward to the point that they have. I mean, is this one of those areas? I mean, the Germans have really placed themselves in a really bad position because they are heavily dependent on the Russians for energy resources. And right now, prices are high. Energy prices in Germany are high. German reserves of natural gas are low. So if there is a supply disruption, there's going to be some real pain for German consumers. But I mean, the Germans really should have seen this coming because the Russians have used energy in the past. I mean, they've turned off the natural gas taps to Ukraine on more than one occasion, right? They have done this to other countries before, not countries as powerful or as important to the Russian economy as the Germans are, but it's not as if we have not seen Putin using energy as a tool to get what Russia wants. And I think the Germans' thinking on this is, look, we were buying natural gas from Russia when it was still the Soviet Union. So if we could trade during the Cold War, why can't we trade now? But I think, Putin has a very different set of priorities right now. And the Germans are going to need to figure out how to diversify their energy sources so that they are not in a position where they are so beholden to the Russians. Right now, so the German government says that Nord Stream 2 is a private project, and it will go online when the German regulatory agency has gone through that application to say that, that they can open the pipeline. So they've been trying to deflect pressure, I think, from the idea that the government could just say that this can't move forward. But the German leader the other day all but said that Nord Stream 2 would not move forward, but again, does not want to be explicit about that. The Biden administration has been very explicit about that. And so I think that as long as they can find at least some supplies of gas to help tide the Germans over till the end of winter, especially if this is like a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I don't know that Germany really will have much choice other than to say Nord Stream 2 can't move forward. One of the interesting things right now, actually, too, and again, this is sort of like the ways in which the Russians manipulate energy for their own purposes. So they're fulfilling their contracts with Germany, but they're not selling them any additional gas, which the Germans could use, right? But the Russians are not doing that. So yeah, I mean, Germany is very vulnerable to this, but they did kind of set themselves up for this.
I have a really good two-part question from an alumnus of Beloit College, class of 1990. Michael had this two-part question, and I'm going to read them both and take as much time to. The first one is, do you think the U.S. and NATO are providing Ukraine enough weapons to defend itself? To which he immediately added, today news showed a 79-year-old great-grandmother training with a military rifle. By contrast, Russia has tanks, missiles, and navy staged. Has Ukraine trained in guerrilla warfare for the long game?
So, Tim, can you go back into the slides, because I do have a comparison of the Russian and Ukrainian military in there. It might be like 4 or 5 slides from the end.
Okay, let me get there. I'm going to take myself out of the picture, so it's big on slides again. Tell me when you.
I think it's before this. It's a few before this one. Yeah. Yeah. Again. Yes. There we are. Okay. Nope. The other one.
That one.
Yes. This one.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. So this is it shows a comparison of Russian and Ukrainian military, and I think that this kind of answers the first part of that question. The Ukrainians are really not in a position to be able to prevent the Russians from overrunning the country. Where the situation gets a little bit trickier is, and this relates to the second part of the question, is whether or not 130,000 Russian forces is enough to subdue Ukraine. And the experience, that the United States had in Iraq and the Soviet experience in Afghanistan suggests that it is by far not enough, right? So, it's one thing to be successful in overthrowing the regime. It is totally another to be able to maintain control over Ukraine. There were concerns amongst the Ukrainian leadership when Russia moved into the Crimea in 2014 about the loyalty of some of those forces. And in fact, a number of people in the Ukrainian military did go over to the Russians. But in Ukraine proper, especially in the western portions where you have a far lower percentage of native Russian speakers in the population, yes, the Ukrainians will fight. And this is why it is so concerning that this actually might happen. There have been 14,000 people that have been killed in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, since the Russians began that separatist struggle several years ago. And the bloodshed is going to be so much worse if we actually have a war in Ukraine, because it is highly unlikely that the Russians are going to be able to suppress Ukrainian resistance quickly or easily. But basically, no, the Ukrainians do not have enough military equipment to stand up to the Russians. And there isn't enough equipment to help them to be able to do that if you're just going to think about a straight up Russia-Ukraine comparison.
All right. Thank you for that great answer to that question. Although, hardly the most hopeful, question you would want to hear, but
Yeah.
Thank you for answering it honestly. last call for questions. If anyone has any questions or commentary, now is the time to get them in. While we're waiting to see if anything comes in, I just wanted to mention that next week we will be looking at changing demographics, both nationally and globally, and we will be looking at that with Professor Elise Cohen of University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. She will be in here, and it doesn't appear that we have any more questions. So with that said, I would like to thank Professor Doughtery for another fantastic lecture. Thank you so much for all the information. Thank you to everyone who followed along online and asked some really good questions. And thank you for attending Great Decisions. It's a fantastic series, and it's great that we can offer it in any of its many formats, whether it's hybrid, whether it's virtual, whether it's in room. Hopefully one day it'll all be back in room, except if a geographic consideration comes into question. But thank you so much for attending Great Decisions this evening. And again, thank you, Professor Doughtery, for a fantastic lecture.
Yeah, thanks everybody for coming out tonight. Thanks for all of your questions, and I look forward to seeing everybody in person next year.
All right. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.